Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to tonight's virtual lecture. My name is Andrew Outen and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers and their French counterparts who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory and legacy of the American Revolution. In addition to tonight's program, the American Revolution Institute fulfills that aim by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done all of this work from its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson in Washington, D.C. Tonight's virtual lecture, a program that is made possible in part by a generous gift from the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, features Dr. Jeanne Abrams discussing the experiences of John and Abigail Adams in Europe. From 1778 to 1788, future President John Adams lived in Europe as an American diplomat. Joined by his wife Abigail in 1784, the two shared rich encounters with famous heads of the European royal courts. Tonight, Dr. Abrams will show that the Adamses' journey not only changed the course of their intellectual, political, and cultural development, but served to strengthen their loyalty to America and highlight how the Adamses and their American contemporaries set about supplanting the British origins with the new American identity. Tonight's program also accompanies our current exhibition, Affairs of State, 118 Years of Diplomacy and Entertaining at Anderson House, which is currently on view through December 31st. Dr. Jeanne Abrams is a professor of history at the University Libraries and Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Denver, where she also serves as the director of the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society and curator of the Beck Archive Special Collections. She is the author of several books, including A View from Abroad, the story of John Adams and Abigail Adams in Europe, The First Ladies of the Republic, Martha Washington, Abigail Adams, Dolley Madison, and the Creation of an Iconic American Role, and Revolutionary Medicine, the Founding Fathers and Mothers in Sickness and in Health. And these were all published by the New York University Press in 2021, 2018, and 2013, respectively. Before I turn things over to Dr. Abrams, however, the usual Zoom housekeeping items are in order. Following tonight's program, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions for Dr. Abrams at any point during the presentation by using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted by using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you as always. So with all of that, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome live from Colorado, Dr. Jeanne Abrams.
Hi, I'm delighted to be with you this evening. And first, I wanted to thank Andrew for being, first of all, such a gracious host, and also for helping us work out some of the technology challenges. He's been extremely patient and helpful. So I know there's another title for this talk, but the way I have it on my computer, I call it An Unlikely Diplomat, John Adams' Revolutionary War Diplomacy in Europe. John Adams has often been overshadowed in the past by some of his flashier colleagues, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, especially of late. But in my research, I've become extremely fond of John Adams and find that he was a man of great integrity, and he was able to get the job done when possible in Europe. And we're going to look a little bit about how difficult that often was. There was little in John Adams's early background that could have predicted he would not only become a primary catalyst in the American Revolution, but also an influential diplomat on behalf of the nascent American Republic, and ultimately the first vice president and second president of the United States. John was descended from a long line of modestly successful middle-class farmers who had long resided in the agricultural hamlet of Braintree, located about 14 miles from Boston in the British American colony of Massachusetts. And I see we had some people in the chat who are here from Massachusetts. He had no aristocratic background, but gifted really with a brilliant mind and a love of learning. After Adams graduated from Harvard College, he became a very successful lawyer. He married above his station, at least that's what Abigail's parents thought, when he wed Abigail Smith, the daughter of a respected local minister and a mother descended from a prominent Massachusetts political family. When John and Abigail married, Massachusetts was still a very loyal English colony in the far-flung British Empire, and neither of them would have dreamed that one day they would help lead America's separation from the mother country, and, maybe more surprising to them, that John would become an internationally known figure. As time passed after they married, both John and Abigail became fervent American patriots, increasingly incensed at what they perceived as England's refusal to allow Americans the full rights of English citizens that they deserved. And both Adamses strongly advocated for independence. John was actually one of the strongest voices in Congress. The couple sacrificed much on behalf of their fragile new nation and literally spent years apart. Often, Abigail acted as a deputy husband, taking on full care of the children and overseeing the farm and business while John was away in Philadelphia and later abroad. John's service in the American Congress marked the beginning of his national political career, but it was his time in Europe that really marked a turning point also for the United States. While the Revolutionary War raged, Adams set out to launch his diplomatic career in Europe, directed by Congress to seek support for the American cause. Twice, John undertook very dangerous 3,000-mile voyages from Boston across the rough Atlantic because of his dedication to his country, and he resided in Europe for nearly a decade. On his first trip, he was accompanied by his eldest son, John Quincy, and that's a story for another day, but John Quincy was exposed probably at a greater degree than any other future Secretary of State to diplomacy in Europe. In February 1778, Adams set out for a hazardous 16-week voyage to France to help Benjamin Franklin negotiate the terms of the Franco-American alliance in the hopes that they would garner support from the French, and that support would help turn the tide of the war in the American favor. On John's second trip to Europe, he was joined by both John Quincy and his middle son, Charles. During his time abroad, though, John and his fellow American emissaries would find themselves largely stymied at every turn by European leaders who jockeyed to secure their nation's hegemony in the transatlantic world. Some of his contemporaries believed that Adams was by nature, by temperament, unsuited to diplomacy. His detractors viewed him as irascible, vain, and ambitious, but his friends saw him as a man of unshakable integrity. He was all of the above: brilliant, fiercely independent, honest to a fault, as well as sometimes stubborn and impetuous. Yet his determination and principled actions are what made his time in Europe successful at several crucial points. Those traits that some didn't find admirable actually helped him negotiate the multiple Dutch loans that were critical to keeping America afloat during the last years of the Revolution. And those traits also contributed to the success of the final 1783 Paris Peace Treaty with England. In 1780, John Adams became the first American emissary from the United States to the Netherlands. And in 1785, he assumed the role of America's first minister, what we'd probably refer to as ambassador today, to England. Economic considerations, particularly his emphasis on the future of American commerce, drove Adams's foreign policy. And in France, Adams clashed frequently with the French foreign minister Vergennes, whom he believed was bent on degrading the American position, and he even antagonized his fellow diplomat Benjamin Franklin. Frustrated, John decided that instead of wasting more time in Paris, his new mission would be to develop what he considered crucial financial and moral support for American independence in the Netherlands, a country that he hoped would be a better match for him. He knew this small country had already supported the American cause by engaging in a brisk trade with America and smuggling armaments. And in mid-August 1780, the Adams party, which included his two sons then and some assistants, arrived in the cosmopolitan metropolis of Amsterdam. John very soon took to taking long walking tours to familiarize himself with all Amsterdam had to offer. And he frequented the smoky, bustling coffee houses to learn more about its inhabitants. Of course, the Netherlands was then a small, independent republic and the commercial hub and banking capital of Europe. Although Adams arrived in Holland as a private citizen, Congress had long agreed with him that the Dutch could be engaged fruitfully. However, it was not until September 1780 that John received his formal commission to engage in economic negotiations, instructing him to act as an agent to raise a loan for the United States. Adams resided in the Netherlands from 1780 to 1782 as an envoy and actively established ties with the social and economic elite, courting bankers, politicians, and other influential people who could support the fledgling American Republic. Adams soon learned, however, that without formal recognition of America by the ceremonial monarch of the Netherlands, Prince William of Orange, and the powerful parliament, no loans from Dutch bankers or merchants would be forthcoming. So he began, as he always did practically, to develop those relationships. John, in the beginning, found that he shared many values with the members of Holland's thriving, industrious middle class, and some of those merchants saw themselves as comrades with the Americans in the cause of liberty. The financial loans that Adams secured came mostly from prosperous entrepreneurs who ran banking and brokerage enterprises in Amsterdam. Some supported the protean Dutch Patriot Republican movement in the nation, which made Adams in turn sympathetic to their political cause. The Patriots in the Netherlands opposed the Dutch royal family who had aligned themselves with the British, so the incipient Dutch revolutionaries were both pro-American and pro-French, which lined up, of course, with some of Adams's goals. Astute Dutch merchants saw an opportunity to expand the scope of their lucrative businesses and increase their profits by working with the Americans. So it was not pure political connections or altruism. It made some good business sense. The risks of pursuing higher profits were offset by the generally responsible manner in which the Americans serviced their loans. And that's partially due to Adams, who was, again, a man of great integrity and very frugal. So in other words, floating loans for the American cause made good business sense for the Dutch. And Adams made some very good friends among the Dutch patriots, including Jeanne E, a professor of Greek and history and the editor of an influential newspaper. Luzak was especially helpful to Adams in his ongoing public relations campaign by publishing many of John's pro-American articles in his newspaper. The professor also translated into Dutch John's bold appeal, we're going to talk about that a little bit later, to the government, which he titled the memorial to the States General. Yet from the beginning, John harbored ambiguous feelings about the Dutch. When things did not progress as quickly as he had hoped, Adams claimed the Dutch were often avaricious in business, plotting in their negotiations, and almost wholly focused on the accumulation of wealth. Although he first wrote his wife Abigail that he was, quote, very much pleased with Holland and the frugality, industry, and cleanliness he found there, he soon carped about the stinginess of the hardy burghers and what he called, quote, a general littleness arising from the incessant contemplation of stivers and droits, nickels and dimes. Adams found much to admire in Holland, but he believed that the Dutch had often carried thriftiness to an extreme. Adams was always a hard worker, disciplined and diligent. To gain official Dutch support during the month of October 1780 alone, John wrote 26 letters to prominent lawyers in Amsterdam to explain the goals of the American Revolution. Remember, no typewriters, no computers, 26 handwritten letters. He worked tirelessly to convince potential supporters in Amsterdam, Leiden, and The Hague to aid the American cause. He even set himself to learning the language by daily reading the local newspaper with the aid of a Dutch dictionary. That was his pattern. In France, he often took a dictionary when he went with John Quincy to the opera play and entertained while he was learning at the same time. Franklin never really acquired much of competence in French. So in some ways, Adams actually was a very conscientious diplomat, and he wanted to speak to the people in their own language when possible. Although his initial overtures were rebuffed and John became discouraged over the convoluted government decision-making process, he set out on a concerted effort to win over the Dutch. After John moved to the Netherlands, the war situation actually worsened for the American side, which made initially the Dutch reluctant to offer financial support. However, circumstances in Europe were slowly changing in a way that appeared promising. In December, England issued what amounted to a declaration of war against Holland and began seizing Dutch ships. The ensuing Anglo-Dutch War lasted from 1780 to 1784. Many of the Dutch burghers resented English interference in their trade, and as a result, they looked forward to developing a profitable relationship with the Americans. And Adams was never one to hesitate to bend the rules of diplomatic convention when he thought it was necessary. Without obtaining prior permission, on May 2nd, 1781, he took the unheard of bold step of directly presenting to the Parliament of the United Provinces and Parliament a memorial to the States General. He composed the missive as a ringing appeal for Dutch recognition of America and a commercial treaty with the United States. Adams donned formal dress suitable for the occasion and traveled by coach and four to present the document to what he termed the high mightinesses in The Hague. He also published the appeal as a pamphlet in English, Dutch, and French. In justifying his actions later to Congress, Adams maintained that the memorial was met with, quote, the most universal and unanimous approbation in all the local newspapers, and no criticism ever appeared against it. In April 1781, John relocated his family from their initial lodgings in Amsterdam to new spacious quarters. For a year, John had rented a commodious house on the Kaisergracht that was within his budget, but also elegant enough to entertain diplomats and potential business partners. He acquired a carriage, a coachman, and a fine team of horses so that he could conveniently travel the city to gather support. Unbeknownst to Adams, while he was in Amsterdam, his diplomatic European status had been amended. Congress had removed him as the sole peace negotiator with Great Britain in June of 1781, so he would later be joined by Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and Thomas Jefferson. It was fortunate for Adams's self-esteem that he did not learn about that reorganization for a year, for by then he could document significant progress in the Netherlands, which really bolstered his self-confidence. In July, Adams returned to Paris to discuss peace negotiations with the French minister Vergennes, but the situation remained rocky. Again, frustrated with his lack of progress in France, Adams returned to Amsterdam. Adams's high level of stress and bouts of really serious illness while he lived in the Netherlands may have magnified his frequent disdain for the leaders of the French, Dutch, and British governments. John's health suffered in the humid climate. He likely contracted malaria, which circulated widely in the 18th century. His sickness, which he termed a, quote, a nervous fever of a dangerous kind, became so severe that at times he lay near death. He wrote to his wife, for 5 or 6 days I was lost and so insensible to the operations of the physicians and surgeons as to have lost my memory of them. And that's what he reported dramatically to Abigail, who was left on the other side of the world to worry. As he slowly improved, Adams informed Franklin back in France that, quote, I am still very far from being a man in health and capable of going through much business. He was so weak after his illness that he did not return to his very active schedule for a month. Yet there was some good news. The American victory at Yorktown in October 1781 had turned the tide of the Revolutionary War, and critical French naval support had helped to break the frustrating military stalemate. The humiliating British defeat renewed the prospects of a peace settlement, and John recovered his optimism and redoubled his diplomatic efforts with the Dutch. Yorktown fortunately served to convince Dutch financiers to back what now appeared to be the winning side. Moreover, 1782 brought a change in the British government, which made future American negotiations more promising. There were also major victories of a different sort in the Netherlands. Everyone knew that the stadtholder was merely a figurehead and that the real power rested in the States General. Still, Adams, who was accused of sometimes of not being a sensitive enough diplomat, did understand that as a royal, Prince William possessed influence and he treated him accordingly. By now, Adams had gained experience with European royalty and the trappings of diplomacy, and so he approached Prince William with, as he told a friend, all the softness, caution, and prudence possible, so that no ill humors might be stirred. John was not fond of William and judged him as an obstacle to the cause of liberty. And he judged him, quote, as incurable as King George III, his cousin. But when in April 1782, Prince William and Princess Wilhelmina formally recognized John as the American minister at their palace in The Hague, John was elated. Adams wrote a friend that he believed that America would now have a faithful ally and that the Declaration of Sovereignty reflected, quote, the most signal epocha in the history of the century. So he may have been exaggerating a bit, but he was certainly encouraged. In March 1782, even before he had received official government recognition from the States General in the Netherlands, John had purchased an imposing 5-story red brick canal house in The Hague to serve as the headquarters of the American legation, the first American embassy the world had ever known. John and his entourage moved into the fine residence in May, when he proudly raised a flag. In a burst of exultation, John later pronounced it a triumph over British pride and claimed that, and this is, again, a little hyperbole, but, quote, not the Declaration of American Independence, not the Massachusetts Constitution, not the alliance with France ever gave me more satisfaction or more pleasing prospects for our country than this event. Although John may have minimized those other seminal events, he was correct that without his diplomatic efforts and the Dutch loans that followed the recognition of the American nation, the financially beleaguered American Republican experiment may have collapsed. Adams frequently entertained dignitaries, merchants, and bankers in the embassy, as he now moved easily in Dutch circles and in court circles. His house featured this new embassy, featured a spacious drawing room decorated with gilded mirrors and crimson damask curtains, and in the large dining room table could seat 16 guests. Even without Abigail by his side, and she wouldn't be joining him for quite a few years, Adams appears to have been capable of overseeing a welcoming and dignified setting for diplomacy. A milestone had been marked in 1782 when the Dutch government formally recognized the United States. It was the second nation in the world after France to do so, and on April 19th, the States General acknowledged Adams formally as the American minister. Now really treated as a respected public figure in Holland, Adams basked in this unaccustomed adulation. He proudly reported to a friend that the Spanish envoy had lauded John's effort, quote, as the grandest step that has ever yet been taken. It is you who have filled this Dutch nation with enthusiasm for your cause and turned their heads. It is a most decisive measure, and it is due to you. Adams could not resist telling a friend, quote, voila, a flower of diplomatic rhetoric, enough to turn my head, whether I have turned those of the Dutchmen or not. And you're just starting to get a little taste. Adams was one of the most articulate writers, and it's really a joy to read his letters and his diary, and especially his letters, the letters that were exchanged between Abigail and John. Yet as late as mid-May, John was still not confident of Dutch loans. I have taken every measure in my power to accomplish it, but I have met with so many difficulties that I almost despair of obtaining anything, he reported glumly to Congress. He even compared himself to a man in the midst of the ocean, negotiating for his life among a school of sharks. John must have been ecstatic later in June when he received the first Dutch loan from consortium of Amsterdam bankers, a significant 5 million guilders at 5% interest. He proudly, if rather modestly, told an American friend that his, quote, Dutch negotiations were one of the most extraordinary in all diplomatic records, but it has succeeded to a marvel. In October 1782, John Adams was finally able to affix his signature to the pivotal Treaty of Amity and Commerce signed at the State House in The Hague, and through it, Adams laid an enduring foundation for Dutch-American friendship. On the heels of his Dutch success, in September, Adams had received an urgent appeal from John Jay, requesting that he help negotiate the long-awaited peace treaty with England now that the British were willing to accept the reality of American independence. When Adams informed the French envoy to the Netherlands he had been summoned to Paris to work on a formal treaty with England, the Minister Vagoyen insisted that it was absolutely necessary that John become involved because of his, quote, immovable firmness that heaven had given him. In a moment of rather wry self-reflection about his volatile personality, Adams wrote, I could not help laughing at this and replying, that I had often had occasion, however, for cooler blood than has fallen to my share. So he was pretty self-aware that he could become irascible, but he was indeed very proud of his accomplishment. John was very pleased that some symptoms, as he put it, of peace were visible on the horizon, but appears to have been in no rush to return to Paris, for his health was still uncertain, and he wanted to finalize his Dutch commercial efforts before departing. Adams arrived in Paris on October 26th, and the next day he took time to make himself presentable for his diplomatic tasks by ordering a custom-made French tailored suit, new shoes, and a fine wig. He also treated himself to a stop to wash away the grime of his journey at a popular bathhouse on the Seine River, where he was furnished with hot towels. As an American diplomat, Adams had become a man of privilege, but he found himself uncomfortable often with its trappings. The high costs of the new purchases irritated him, and John observed rather disdainfully that French modes of fashion were so influential in Europe that only French tailoring was acceptable for diplomacy. Quote, "This is one of the ways," he huffed, "in which France taxes all of Europe and will tax America." Of the five peace commissioners, Jefferson was unable to sail from America in time to participate in the negotiations, and Henry Lawrence, who had been captured as a British prisoner of war after crossing the Atlantic, languished in prison. Only Franklin, Adams, and Jay remained to carry on. With successful Dutch economic negotiations concluded, Adams was warmly received in Paris. Even his own nemesis, Vigennes, was hospitable, inviting Adams to dine at his home as an honored guest. Through Jay's intervention, Adams and Franklin were able to maintain at least an outwardly cordial relationship. The team worked productively together, with the three of them often dining while working through the complex issues that lay before them. This despite the fact that Adams was capable of nursing a grudge, particularly when he felt that his reputation had been maligned, and John still resented the critical remarks that Benjamin Franklin had made about his diplomatic skills to Congress. As he put it rather petulantly to Arthur Lee, another of the diplomats, "I wish it were possible to blot out that page of history, his insolent persecutions of you, me, and others, and the motives of sordid jealousy and insidious selfishness. Franklin and Adams started out as great friends, but while Adams was in Paris originally, he and Franklin really grew farther apart. He felt that Franklin had been too focused on social events, and Adams didn't appreciate that many of those social interactions were really an aid to diplomacy. They had very different styles, and Adams ended up basically in Paris when he first came, really doing all the grunt work, all the bookkeeping, et cetera, because Franklin kept very erratic hours. But during these Paris peace negotiations, to his credit, John's dedication to his mission overrode personal feelings, and Jay really helpfully mediated the differences between his fellow commissioners. If the relationship between Franklin and Adams remained somewhat fraught, Jay and Adams got along especially well. Jay was a decade Adams's junior, but both men were skilled lawyers. Adams knew Jay from the time the two had served together in the Continental Congress, although during that period, the two men did not always see political events from the same perspective. Unlike the Adamses, the Jays were part of a wealthy New York family, and they were unapologetic slave owners. Adams, on the other hand, was proud of the fact that, as he said, that he had never owned another person and was largely a self-made man. But despite John Adams's anti-slavery sentiments, the fate of African Americans who had supported the British during the American Revolution was sidestepped during the final peace treaty. The issue was discussed, but it was left unresolved, largely in an effort to appease the American Southern faction. In Paris, Adams and Jay discovered that their political outlooks had grown more aligned. Adams later declared that Franklin had been cooperative and helpful, but that John Jay was the man most responsible among the three diplomats for the ultimate success of the negotiations with the British. An extremely generous and somewhat uncharacteristic gesture by Adams, who was never one to downplay his own contributions. He even noted privately in his diary that most of the credit, quote, belongs to Mr. Jay. It's certain that much of Jay's earlier draft for the peace treaty remained in the final iteration. When Jay returned to America in 1784, Adams continued to praise him and declared that, quote, our worthy friend Mr. Jay returns to his country like a bee to his hive, with both legs loaded with merit and honor. Still, John noted proudly in his diary that the French had taken to referring to Adams as Le Washington de la Négociation, the Washington of negotiations. At the start of the peace talks with the English, how to handle France remained a pivotal issue. Both Adams and Jay agreed that they would not allow France to dictate settlement terms to the newly independent America. And Franklin, despite his earlier amiable connections with Vergennes, understood that the American representatives needed to act in harmony if they were to succeed. Yet their agreement over the relationship with France meant that the American diplomats had to discard, if not outright violate, the early Franco-American alliance of 1778. In that treaty, the Americans had agreed not to make a separate peace with Great Britain. When Adams was reminded of that caveat, he was irritated and threatened to resign. In the end, the three American diplomats ignored the advice from Congress and proceeded directly to negotiate with the British. As Adams perceptively noted in his diary in November 1782, there was something in the minds of the English and French which impelled them irresistibly to war every 10 or 15 years. Although not unique in this outlook, Adams especially feared American entanglement in European affairs, and he insisted that America has been long enough involved in the wars of Europe. She had been a football between contending nations from the beginning, and it was easy to see that France and England both would endeavor to involve us in their future wars. Thus, John maintained that the best course was for America to connect with European nations through commerce, not through military or political alliances. Franklin, who in the past had presented a very accommodating persona to both the French and British ministers, allowed Jay and Adams to proceed with a single-minded firmness that reflected America's independence and status as that independent nation. The main British negotiator, Richard Oswald, a Scottish merchant, took a conciliatory view toward the United States, and the Minister of War, Lord Shelburne, influenced in part by his progressive support of free trade, dealt generously with the Americans. Unsurprisingly, those British diplomats, their actions were criticized by other members of the British ministry, as well as by King George III. In addition to Oswald, the American emissaries also had to contend with the British Undersecretary of State, Henry Strachey, who had insisted that American loyalists deserved compensation for property and financial losses, a controversial subject that would surface again in the future, even after the signing of the final treaty. On November 30th, 1782, after 5 intense weeks of negotiations, the American emissary signed a preliminary but crucial peace treaty with Great Britain at Oswald's Hotel. As Adams put it, we had been very industrious, having been at it forenoon, afternoon, and evening ever since my arrival. Representatives of England, but also from France, Spain, the Netherlands, and potential mediators from Austria and Russia, all played a part in the complex discussion to end what had essentially become a world war. Although France was at the time America's most important ally, Vergennes and the elderly Comte de Maurepas, the head minister of King Louis XVI's government, understandably always put French interests first. Both had to take into consideration France's finances, strained to the breaking point in part due to support of the Americans, as well as a very vocal political faction which urged peace with England. A rapprochement between America and Britain was not always perceived as desirable by French leaders, focused on retaining France's position in the balance of power. The signing of the preliminary peace treaty between America and England left Vergennes astonished, particularly at the degree of the British concessions. But Franklin was able to use his considerable diplomatic talents and relationship with the French minister to smooth over the discord. In the end, the Americans had really secured nearly all their demands from Britain. These included the rights of navigation on the Mississippi River, the annexation of British territory between the Appalachians on the east and the Mississippi on the west, which doubled the size of the U.S., and the acknowledgement of American fishing rights along the coast of Newfoundland. A final peace treaty, which included not only the formal recognition of American independence and the withdrawal of British forces, but also generous territorial rights for the Americans, would be executed in early September 1783. At one point, after the preliminary treaty was concluded, only half in jest, John wrote ruefully to Abigail that, quote, "My children will have nothing but their liberty and the right to catch fish in the banks of Newfoundland. That is all the fortune I have been able to make for myself or them." He was exaggerating a bit because the Adamses eventually left Europe in a comfortable status, but he was never wealthy, and money was never his driving force. Adams had played a critical role in the negotiations, but he was left again feeling that Congress had not really significantly or sufficiently appreciated his efforts. Still, Adams moved forward. He recorded that on the evening of January 1st, 1783, he visited Versailles, where to his astonishment, he was really greeted with exceptional cordiality by Vergennes, to whom he delivered a copy of the treaty draft. This was the very man who had openly maligned Adams to Congress, but John in turn was studiously polite. Despite unaccustomed praise from the French minister, Adams kept his counsel and refused to divulge any of the details of the negotiations. Adams also took the time to attend a palace ceremony where, according to him, the Queen Marie Antoinette shone in great splendor. Later in the month, Adams paid his respects to King Louis XVI and the royal family, and noted that the Queen and King appeared in high health and in gay spirits. Although on one level, John admired Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, he continued really to look with disdain on their ostentatious court lifestyle. Adams viewed Louis XVI as a man of character, but he confided in his diary that in France, quote, "the demon of monarchy haunts all the scenes of life. The people can esteem but one, the king, and to that one their homage is adulation and idolatry." Moreover, John maintained that Vergennes and the other French ministers had often tried to derail American plans, and he insisted that unlike Franklin and some members of Congress, he had always adhered to firmness in his negotiations. Although John felt he had often been unfairly derided for his obstinacy, he reiterated that he had always acted in the best interests of America, as the French, through what he perceived the machinations of Vergennes, were endeavoring to make my countrymen meek and humble, but I was laboring to make them proud. Although Jeanne Abrams has been criticized for being overly suspicious and even paranoid about the motives and intent of his European diplomatic counterparts, historian Richard B. Morris has ably demonstrated that Abrams had good reason to find their efforts suspect. Both Abrams and Jay viewed Vergennes as a manipulative minister who planned to keep the Americans subservient for the foreseeable future. Vergennes was similarly skeptical about the motives of the American negotiators. To his credit, Abrams stubbornly refused to acquiesce to any agreements that violated fundamental American goals, and he vocally protested his objections to Vergennes. His really consistent arguments put, as Morris said, a spoke in the wheel that resulted in a favorable outcome for America and effectively ended plans for proposed mediations and the treaty by third parties. Moreover, John Jay had insisted that no peace talks would occur before Britain formally recognized his country as an independent nation, a stance that helped to strengthen the American position. Historian Morris concluded that, quote, by their shrewdness, discernment, and tenacity, the three Americans in Paris won independence and a continental domain for 13 littoral states. The treaty marked the legitimacy of the new American nation. In the final analysis, Abrams, Jay, and Franklin had surmounted all the knotty issues surrounding the discussions and had refused to compromise on all essential points. For the American commissioners viewed themselves as instruments of the new revolutionary society, and as such would not settle for less than total victory. Certainly, Abrams saw himself as a committed warrior on behalf of his country. He continued to worry about European aggression and French jealousy of the American nation, which he considered to be at that time still just but a brittle vessel. And the nation indeed was very fragile at the time. John told his good friend James Warren Beck in Massachusetts that he considered America at peace, but not out of danger. Amidst all the joys of peace and the glorious prospects before us, I see in Europe so many causes of inquietude. Hardly the sentiments of a man who was later accused of abandoning his Republican principles and veneration of monarchy in European life. After the conclusion of the 1783 peace treaty, John was posted to France as an American emissary, along with Franklin and Jefferson. And in 1784, he was finally joined in Europe by his long-suffering and dearest friend, Abigail, and daughter, Nabby. The Adamses first resided in France and then moved to England in 1784, when Adams became the first American minister to England. While the Adamses remained in France, John continued his frustrating efforts to make progress with the French foreign minister. And for example, with both Franklin and Jefferson sidelined with illness, John met several times on his own with Vergennes to discuss a possible solution to the ever-present threat of piracy on the seas by making a treaty with the Barbary states and Morocco. Vergennes, that shrewd diplomat, listened politely, but conveniently concluded that the subject was simply out of his purview and just kicked the can down the road. To John's chagrin, Vergennes asked Adams to write up all the Americans' concerns, and he told John that he would then convey the information to the Minister of Marine. Nothing was resolved, and Adams and Jefferson later had to revisit the piracy issue once they were in London. In late February 1785, Congress appointed Adams the first United States minister to Great Britain, but it was not until April 26th that Adams received official notification of his new assignment. Jefferson, soon to be named minister to France, brought Adams the welcome news along with instructions that John was to appear in London by the time of King George's birthday celebration, which was scheduled to take place in early June. Jefferson and Adams were tasked anew with negotiating commercial treaties in Europe, and they hoped that the British invitation that had welcomed an American ambassador to the court of St. James served as a positive sign. In early May, John again met with Riggins, who congratulated him on his new appointment and told him that it's a great thing to be the first ambassador from your country to the country you sprung from. Abigail was less pleased with her husband's new posting. She and John lived a pleasant life in Auteuil near Paris once she had become accustomed to their huge mansion, beautiful grounds, and the social customs. But she still longed for her home in America. She confided to her sister that it would be vastly more to my taste and much more to my satisfaction to return to my own country and live in that social friendship and simplicity in which I formerly rejoiced. I take no pleasure in a life of ceremony and parade. Still, Abigail admitted to her uncle back home that given her husband's long experience in Europe and his unwavering commitment to promoting the welfare of his country, John was more likely than, quote, a new hand to succeed as a diplomat in England and in obtaining an economic treaty. On May 10th, 1785, John and Abigail's daughter Nabby recorded the news of her father's upcoming position matter-of-factly in her journal. Papa went to Versailles today and took leave of this court. He has been appointed to England. Mr. Jefferson succeeds him here. With mixed emotions, Abigail, John, and Nabby would leave from their house in Auteuil on May 20th. John fretted that living in London would be more expensive and politically challenging than in France. Moreover, he was understandably uncertain whether he would meet, quote, with a candid or even decent reception in England, or if he would make any headway moving American objectives forward. Quote, "It is not to be expected that I should be cherished and beloved," he observed sardonically, but he took a certain grim comfort in the words of a London gentleman he had met in The Hague who told him that, quote, "I certainly know there is no man in public life whom the English fear as much as they do you." Before he left France, John echoed Abigail's distaste for the pomp of European courts. He wrote John Jay that, quote, "the essence of things is lost in ceremony in every country in Europe, but we must submit to what we cannot alter." Although Abigail was relieved she would be living in a country in which she would not need an interpreter, she was apprehensive about how she would be welcomed in England as the wife of the first American minister. Some of her tolerance and appreciation for France stemmed from the fact that their strong political alliance was with America early on, but that, of course, was not the case with England. She also expected to be subject to more scrutiny in England than she had been in France. And now that Adams was officially appointed, she would have official duties in England, which she had not really had in France. Abigail reflected about the move in a letter she penned to her niece, quote, "I shall have some regret, I assure you, in quitting Auteuil, since I must leave it for London instead of America, that being the designation that Congress has assigned us. In many respects, I think I shall find myself happier in London, but that will depend much upon our reception there and the course which politics take." The family arrived in London on May 26th as Abigail and John opened a new chapter in the European sojourn. The Adamses would spend more than 3 years in England. The day after their arrival, John met the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Carmarthen, who received the American minister with a measure of respect. And by mid-June, Adams would begin talks with the minister to discuss the future of the American and British economic relationship. With a population of close to 1 million people, London was the largest city in the world at the time when Jeanne and Abigail Adams took up residence there in late May 1785. John initially viewed his appointment as America's first minister plenipotentiary to the court of St. James's in the British capital as the high point of his diplomatic career. Instead, it was his negotiations to obtain multiple Dutch loans at critical junctures during the American Revolution and the following years of the early fragile American nation that would really mark his greatest success. After he received notification of his new role in England, Adams wrote, quote, "The appointment to the court of Great Britain demands my most grateful acknowledgments to Congress and the utmost care and diligence in the execution of it." He proceeded consciously to rebuild the American relationship with Great Britain in a manner that he hoped would benefit his home nation. Still, when John learned afterwards that his appointment to England had been debated at length in Congress by those who accused him of vanity and believed he was temperamentally unsuited for the position, his pride was wounded. Elation turned to indignation and disappointment, for he believed that his knowledge about foreign affairs, long years of experience and sacrifices on behalf of his country were unappreciated by the American public and his political colleagues. Yet, after much soul-searching, John's commitment to the public good propelled him forward, and he redoubled his efforts. We can vividly reconstruct the initial meeting between King George and Adams through John's eyes. Indeed, his remains the only first-hand account, so of course it reflects his perceptions. Accompanied by the foreign minister who had provided his personal carriage to transport the new American minister, a dapper and visibly nervous John, attired in a sober but fashionable suit, a newly purchased powdered wig, and wearing an impressive ceremonial sword, made his way through the palace before he was conducted to the anteroom. It was crowded with British ministers, foreign diplomats, bishops, and members of the British aristocracy, all awaiting an audience with the king. Even a sober New Englander like Adams realized that he needed to project a persona that reflected the refinement of dress required by those who moved among royalty. He was sensitive to the stares of the members of the British court, who surveyed the American minister with skepticism, and Adams was gratified that the Dutch and Swedish ambassadors cordially engaged him in conversation and made him welcome. John was guided through the monarch's grand reception room, and after being announced as His Excellency, the American minister, he was finally ushered into the king's private reception chamber known as His Majesty's Closet. Once in the presence of the king, John recorded that he made the 3 required reverence bows. As John noted, he was following the age-old prescribed modes of protocol, of usage, as he called it, established at this and at all northern courts of Europe. Adams told John Jay that he then presented King George III with his formal appointment documents from Congress. That was customary at an initial meeting between the monarch and a new ambassador, and that he, quote, addressed myself to His Majesty in the following words: "The United States of America have appointed me their minister plenipotentiary to your Majesty." Next, John paid his compliments to the king and told him that he had been instructed to convey the unanimous instructions of Congress to, quote, cultivate the most friendly and liberal intercourse between your Majesty's subjects and their citizens, and of their best wishes for your Majesty's health and happiness, and for that of your royal family. It was a conciliatory gesture, which George III seemed to appreciate. Despite the high costs of the Revolutionary War, the British were still left in a strong economic position, so they retained the upper hand in trade negotiations with the Americans. During his years in London, John would do his utmost to foster an amicable relationship between America and England, as his most pressing goal was to secure a favorable trade agreement. In his presentation to King George, Adams was respectful and dignified. He understood that in the late 18th century, the government was the king's, regardless of the advice or opinions of His Majesty's ministers, and he was intent on making a good impression in persuading the monarch to support economic treaties. Adams told the monarch he would, quote, esteem myself the happiest of men if I can be instrumental in recommending my country more and more to your Majesty's royal benevolence, and of restoring an entire esteem, confidence, and affection between people who, though separated by an ocean and under different governments, have the same language, a similar religion, and a kindred blood. It was a tall order, but John's sincerity met with more success than he anticipated. He wrote John Jay that the British monarch, quote, was indeed much affected, and I confess I was not less so. Despite the understandable awkwardness and residual injured feelings, John reported that King George told him that I not only receive with pleasure the assurances of the friendly dispositions of the United States, but that I am very glad the choice has fallen to you to be their minister. When the monarch asked Adams for details about his feelings toward England's rival, France, John responded without hesitation that his full loyalty was to America, not to any European power. Adams reported to Jefferson that his presentation was treated by the British monarch with, quote, all the respect and the person with all the kindness which could have been expected or reasonably desired, and with much more, I confess, that was in fact expected by me. Following an exchange of pleasantries, as protocol demanded, the king bowed to signal the end of the interview, and Adams took his leave, retreating backwards. John had cleared the first hurdle successfully. He was accepted as a legitimate diplomatic representative of an independent country, even though privately the king and his ministers had little confidence in the survival of the American government. America's first audience with the king seemed like a personal and American triumph. Yet John and Abigail would soon find that courtesy and fine manners did not necessarily translate into action, nor the desired acknowledgement that they were the equals to the British. Within a month, John became pessimistic about his ability to negotiate a favorable commercial agreement. Indeed, the British ministry, including Lord Carmarthen and Prime Minister Pitt, continued to thwart Adams throughout his stay in England. John often felt he encountered a brick wall when he visited the Prime Minister at 10 Downing Street, yet another reason for him to disdain British diplomacy. And even at the start, all was far from idyllic. Abigail noted to her sister that almost immediately, quote, the Tory venom has begun to spit itself forth in the public papers, as I expected, bursting with the envy that an American minister should be received here with the same marks of attention, politeness, and civility which are shown to other ministers of any other power. In a letter written to Jefferson shortly after she arrived in London, Abigail reported with her typical wry humor that one of the local newspapers had commented condescendingly, quote, an ambassador from America, good heavens, what a sound. Soon after, the London Times observed in a perturbed tone, quote, can there be a stronger proof of the mutability of human affairs than the arrival of John Adams in the capacity of ambassador from North America? This gentleman, who was formerly proscribed as a rebel to this country, now appears invested with all the privileges and ranks annexed to the representatives of a free state, and the title of excellency is now substituted by those very persons who formerly styled him traitor. Soon John had cause to revise his earlier positive views about George III. Adams found the king to be, quote, the most accomplished courtier in his dominion, and so focused on the little things of life that he was inattentive to the great affairs of society and the government. Moreover, Adams found the king obstinate. Flattered by the unceasing adulation he received, John believed George III became so convinced of the correctness of his ideas that he frequently ignored counsel, particularly when it came to American economic negotiations. Despite the concerted efforts of both Adams and Jefferson, England and France would remain impervious to opening their ports to reciprocal trade agreements. The United States was only able to sign liberal trade treaties with Russia, Sweden, and the Netherlands, but those three small countries offered a limited potential market for American products. No matter how diligent the Americans' efforts, the British cabinet really stubbornly refused their overtures. And in October of 1785, Adams wrote Jay in frustration that he could, quote, obtain no answer from the ministry to any one demand, proposal, or inquiry. By the spring of 1786, both Adamses had become increasingly restless living in England. And despite John's diligence, they were resigned to a lack of American diplomatic progress. To make matters worse, according to Abigail, since the Joint Commission of American Ministers expired in May, nothing could be finalized until new players were put in place. In strict confidence, she shared with her sister Mary details of the many impenetrable obstacles that had confronted John in Europe. And she noted with palpable frustration that whoever has anything to do with courts must have patience. By that time, the Adamses viewed the main thrust of British policy to be the economic subjugation of America. Normalized trade with the British would not occur until the 1796 Jay Treaty under President Washington. And that agreement was controversial, as the British were at the time at war with the French, who were angry that the Americans they had supported during the Revolution would make a deal with their enemy. It was Abigail's fervent hope that she would be able to return to America the following spring, but that did not occur until 1788. She complained bitterly that, quote, there is no office more undesirable than that of the Minister of the United States. Under the present embarrassments, there is no reputation to be acquired, and there is much to lose. She placed some of the blame on the weak American government and called for unity. Negotiations, she said, with other powers may be and have been effected, but with England, there is not the least possibility of a treaty until the states are united in their measures and invest Congress with full powers for the regulation of diplomacy. Jefferson later echoed Abigail's sentiments when he really sympathized with John's desire to leave England. I do not wonder at your being tired out by the conduct of the court you are at, he commiserated with Adams. Yet at the same time, Jefferson urged him to redouble his efforts in Holland and to build on his previous achievements with the Dutch. In January 1787, John informed the Massachusetts delegates in Congress that, quote, to be explicit, I am determined to come home. In February, he wrote to Jay that he wished to leave Europe the following year and declared morosely that a life so useless to the public and so insipid to myself as mine is in Europe has become a burden to me, as well as to my countrymen. Jay shared many of his colleagues' views about the deficiencies of European life. Near the end of his diplomatic posting in Spain, Jay wrote a friend that my eyes and affections are constantly turned towards America, and I think I shall return to it with as much real and cordial satisfaction as ever an exiled Israelite felt on returning to his land of promise. Adams was adamant about his desire to return to America when he declared to his relative Cotton Tufts that, quote, I am determined not to remain an hour in Europe after my expiration of my commission to the court. Before the Adamses left Europe in 1788, filled with optimism about the new American Constitution and thrilled at the prospect of returning home. John still took 2 crucial trips to the Netherlands to secure additional loans to pay off the nation's large interest debt. Abigail shared John's outlook and in a letter to her sister wrote, "We are determined to come back to America and share the fate of our country." Despite his pessimism about his diplomatic mission, John was successful in securing yet another Dutch loan when he visited Amsterdam in the late spring of 1787. In a letter to Jefferson, still the American envoy to France at the time, he put the object of his excursion to Holland bluntly. It was to procure money, and I had the good fortune to obtain as much as was necessary for the then purpose. As they left, both the Adamses had been definitely enriched by their time in Europe and felt that they had been exposed to really very many wonderful opportunities and culture and history that they did not have at home. But their center of gravity always remained in America. As Abigail had put it, after a short time in France, "My heart and soul is more American than ever. We are a family by ourselves." Thanks so much for your attention. And if there are some questions, I'm sure that Andrew will field them for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abrams. We do have some questions that I'm seeing, and folks can feel free to submit them either via the chat or preferred in the Q&A. But we did have one question. How did John Adams, that is, his experience in Holland compare to that of John Jay's in Spain?
Actually, John Jay had a similarly frustrating experience in Spain as John did later in England and France to some extent. So it's amazing. I guess I would say for them together, for the two of them, their greatest success was in the peace negotiations where they worked together very well. But there was one point that I had to cut the talk, and even as I cut it, it was probably longer than it should have been. But they talked, both of them, back and forth, and John considerably, very frequently, kind of metaphorically scratched his head and says, "There's just something here in negotiations in Europe that Americans cannot understand. They just don't seem to," I'm paraphrasing, they just seem not to use any common sense here. And things that make perfect sense to us, they won't agree to. So yes, Jay's time in Spain was very frustrating, and he was thrilled to leave.
Great. And from the same attendee, they would like to know, was Adams in Holland when the Continental frigate Andrew Doria was saluted in St. Eustatius?
I do not know. I'm sorry to say. We can look it up, but I don't know.
No worries. Another question that just came through. Did Adams and Franklin ever become friendly again?
I think sometimes Abigail could carry a grudge longer than John could. So she always remembered the very negative report that Franklin had given about John Adams to Congress. And, it really is very sad that they started out on very good terms when John first came to France, and Franklin actually gave him quarters in the mansion that he had been renting. So I can't say they became friends again, but they worked together when necessary. And John was always nothing if not practical. It was nothing like the reconciliation between Jefferson and Adams. Again, Jefferson and Adams, such close friends. They even took a multi-week trip together, touring historic sites and houses and mansions and gardens in Europe when they were both stationed in Europe, and such close friends, and then became, of course, bitter enemies because of differing politics. But fortunately, they were able to reconcile in old age, and we have some wonderful, wonderful letters between Adams and Jefferson where they talk about all manners of things. I don't think that Abigail ever forgave Jefferson, but while they were in Europe together, she considered him one of, quote, again, I'm just loosely quoting, one of the choicest people in the world. And he admired her greatly. The Adamses were quite frugal and very good stewards of their finances, and Jefferson really, died in great depth. And so in Europe, while he was there, he wrote Madison and praised Abigail for her great skills with economy, and she pretty much ran that side of the Adams household.
Thank you. And somebody would like to know if you can offer any insight or remarks on John's interaction with Lafayette and his wife, Adrienne, while in France, if there was any.
Oh, well, yes. Not so much that I know about Jeanne specifically, but Mrs. Lafayette was one of the few women that Abigail actually admired in France. She praised her in her letters to her sister. She felt that many French women were very involved in society, but were not very good caretakers of their family. And she specifically praised her for putting her husband and children first in her life. So yes, they did interact quite a bit when the year that Abigail and John were in France together.
Interesting. And we have a few questions. A lot of people want to know who financed their time in Europe. Was it the government? Was it the Congress, or was it the Adamses themselves?
It was largely the government, and John and Abigail in particular never stopped complaining about how little money they were given by Congress. Abigail said very hard to impress and take care of your diplomatic duties when you're given a shoestring budget. But despite all the carping, they actually entertained quite well, and they may have used some of their money privately, but again, as I said, she was a very good steward of their finances, and they left Europe in quite good financial stable state. But they did have an allowance, and she also felt that the minister received very little, at least insignificant, insufficient salary, but they did fine.
Great. You mentioned when they were negotiating the Treaty of Paris that they had John had some interactions with the Habsburgs, Austrians, and the Russians. Did he have any strong opinions or other interactions with the Habsburgs or Catherine?
Yeah, his opinion was that it was not their business and they should not be invited in, and that was pretty much the policy of particularly Jay and Adams. And Franklin was sidelined quite a bit with illness during the negotiations. And he also, I think, was a realist in many ways. So he left a lot of the negotiations to Adams and Jay. And again, they really consciously tried to proceed as if they were an independent country, which, that was their thought and what they had hoped they would be recognized as such. But they really did not want to have any involvement from other third parties. They wanted to negotiate directly.
Sure. And I think this is a good question to drive it all home. How did John's experience in Europe reflect during his presidency?
That's very interesting. We didn't even get to this in the talk, even though you intimated in the introduction that I might, but there really wasn't enough time. The Adamses already had somewhat of a negative view of Europe before they left. And again, they much appreciated the culture and long history. And so they were skeptical, and even though the monarchs themselves, they admired sometimes on a personal level, they really felt that the monarchy, particularly in France, less so in England, because John actually admired the British government to some extent. But how did it affect his presidency? I would say that, first of all, and I said it even during the lecture, John was very skeptical of the motives of both France and England. And he also felt that kind of a precursor to the Monroe Doctrine about staying out of European affairs, that he felt that America had been kind of a football tossed, between warring countries. So I think he studiously tried to avoid a lot of interaction with when they could. But he also, on the other hand, was more open, was more supportive. One of the reasons that Jefferson and Adams fell out was that Jefferson actually admired on one level the French Revolution, and though Adams felt that there certainly was need for reform in France, the extreme bloody path that the French Revolution took was really abhorrent to him. And he wrote at one point that we know the French can tear things down, but what can they build up? So I think he was very careful in his negotiation. On the other hand, he probably the most successful undertaking during his presidency was that he actually avoided a war with France and was able to negotiate. So I think he learned. I think he was very distrustful, but I think he was very pragmatic at the same time.
Sure. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Dr. Abrams, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. You still have some daylight left, I'm sure, over
yes, at our side, and it's a beautiful day out. So
thank you for everything. Thank you to all of you who joined us this evening on Zoom, and for your continued support of our mission. And we will see you next time. So I would say get home safe, but everybody's home. So take care. Thank you again, Dr. Abrams.
My pleasure. Nice to be with you. Thank you.
Take care. Good night.